and welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman Live. It is Tuesday, February 27th, 2024. It's great, as always, to be with you. You can call in at 1-844-861-5537. That's 1-844-861-5537. And of course, as always, you can use the chat, but keeping it classy in the chat is our rule. So far, you guys have been pretty great. Hello, Misinformation. Great, as always, to be with you.
Yo.
How are you doing this fine morning?
Jules.
Doing well?
I'm well. How are you?
Good for you, Regis. I'm well, too.
Please. Please.
Had to be there for the reference to Sean's middle name yesterday. We have such a good show today. I mean, I would hope that every single day we have a good show, but this one especially is super packed with wisdom because we are bringing on Spencer Klavan for our Thinker of the Month series. God, we've got to be up to like 8 or 9 at this point. We started it almost a year ago, and I really encourage you to go back and look at some previous episodes of our Thinker of the Month series. We have profiled so many thinkers of the month. Believe me, we've done Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Genevan philosopher who was kind of the progenitor of this very rampant social idea that we see today, that it is society that corrupts people. People are born perfect in the state of nature, but then all of these external forces make them bad. That, of course, is, as I said, sort of what we're seeing today with the whole, poverty or racism causes you to commit crime. Or as a recent headline says, climate change is caused by racism. So we've talked about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we've talked about Karl Marx, an ever relevant thinker to today. We have discussed Charlotte Bronte, who is one of my favorite authors of the very famous, fantastic book, which I probably reference 5 times a week minimum, Jane Eyre. We did a December Thinker of the Month episode on Jesus Christ, who's, arguably the Thinker of the Month for the month of December, but the thinker of every single month. So those are just to name a few. Oh, also Friedrich Nietzsche, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I especially encourage people to watch, as January was the 50th anniversary of the Gulag Archipelago, and it is especially relevant to watch in the wake of the murder of another Russian dissident, Alexei Navalny. So please do look at those previous episodes. So we'll be welcoming on Spencer in about 15 minutes. But first, starting with, I guess, not the lightest topic, there was a terrible act of self-protest that occurred on Sunday. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. It was the self-immolation of a United States airman, a 25-year-old named Aaron Bushnell, in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. Now, there are some really graphic photos online of this self-immolation. We're not, of course, going to put those up. You see here a photo of the Israeli embassy. I actually lived in Washington, D.C. when I was a junior in college because we were sent away from campus due to the COVID lockdowns. By the way, Dennis Prager always advises me to say, don't say that you were sent home due to COVID. You weren't sent home due to the existence of the virus. You were sent home due to the lockdowns. So I lived in Washington, D.C. We lived not far away from the Israeli embassy. No offense to the embassy. I always thought it was a particularly ugly building, but it's just shocking to learn of that news. And Mr. Bushnell actually live streamed his self-immolation on Twitch, and I watched it. I watched the video in full last night before I went to bed. Don't ask me why I did it. Maybe I enjoy making my life harder for myself. But what was so chilling, really, about that video, in addition, of course, to the act itself, was how determined and resigned this individual was before he did it. Now, I didn't say this, I thought it was kind of obvious, but his background, he proclaimed to do this to protest what he calls the genocide taking place at the hands of the Israelis in Gaza. And he, when he was live streaming this, he went on and he said, I'm about to engage in a very extreme act of protest, but it is not extreme at all compared to what is going on at the hands of our government and the Israeli government in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. And he said, this is what the ruling class has decided they're going to let happen. And I'm telling you, it was the craziest thing. He said that, he put the phone down, he stood in front of the embassy, he doused himself in gasoline. And within seconds, he was gone. He was screaming out, free Palestine, free Palestine. And then he was so consumed by the pain that he started just screaming wildly, and then he was dead. Cheerful, right? For Tuesday, February 27th, 2024, the episode of the live stream. But it's this act of protest is endlessly fascinating to me. The first time I learned about self-immolation as protest was actually in a spectacular Vietnam War class I took when I was a freshman in college. And this is perhaps one of the most famous examples. We have a photo, not of the immolation, dear God, but of the Buddhist monk just a few seconds before this happened. And this took place in Saigon, which is in South Vietnam, in June of 1963. So we were beginning our involvement in Vietnam. We were already there for a few months after the French lost in the war against the Vietnamese, and then the French pulled out, if you will, of Vietnam, and there was this, problem between the North Vietnamese who wanted to make the country communist, the South Vietnamese who wanted to not make the country communist. We were supporting the South Vietnamese, and we propped up this leader Diem in the South. And so this Buddhist monk, in an act of protest, doused himself in gasoline and self-immolated because he was protesting what he said was the persecution of Buddhists by Diem, the leader, the South Vietnamese leader who we, the United States, propped up because he was anti-communist, but he was also persecuting religious minorities, including Buddhists. And this act of self-immolation was quite instrumental, actually, in the United States decision later that year in November of 1963, shortly before the assassination of President Kennedy, when we decided to oust Diem from power. The CIA backed a coup in South Vietnam to overthrow Diem. So that's just a little history of the ways that, self-immolation has played a role in United States foreign policy. And so it will be very interesting to see how the government reacts to this. I don't frankly think it will do very much, but it is just a haunting thing that someone would do that to themselves, and that someone would be in the kind of mental state to engage in that kind of self-protest. I hope that this individual is in a better, healthier, more peaceful state now. And so the self-immolation as protest obviously is not just confined to the United States or United States adjacent kind of foreign policy matters. It's been used really actually quite a lot over the past 60 years, especially. For instance, there are many Tibetans, I think over about 100 Tibetans in the past decade, who have engaged in this kind of protest in order to combat China's persecution of them. There was a famous incident of a merchant in Tunisia, and I believe either 2009 or 2010, who was protesting the dictatorial government to which he was subjected. So go down your rabbit hole on the internet if you'd like to read about it, but it really is fascinating. Now on to a, I suppose, lighter, but maybe not quite light subject, but I also find this to be so interesting. I got an email from a listener of this show who lives in Berlin. He's 26 years old. I actually met him when I was in Berlin. You never know what's going to happen, by the way, if you email me. I love hearing from listeners. I respond, and I've really gotten to know many people who listen to this show, and Dennis and Julie, and it's been just a thrilling, and hugely enriching part of my job. But I want to sort of introduce on this show, Timeless with Julie Hartman Live, more emails that I get from listeners because they are just so cool. I will read some segments from this email from Will about what's going on in Germany with regard to the Israel-Gaza war. He has some really interesting insights about the way that different factions in Germany are kind of dealing with this. But I've just got to give you a little tease of some other emails that I got. There's a fantastic young woman who's 18 years old, and she emailed me about a year ago. She listens to Dennis and Julie and Timeless, and she is a freshman at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. Michigan, which is a conservative, I believe, Christian college. And she writes to me telling me about her classes that she's in. And the names of these classes, people, I got to tell you, I was reading them and I was thinking, why didn't I go to Hillsdale? They're so cool. I mean, I'm grateful I went to Harvard. I talk about this all the time. For all that I criticize Harvard, and it is worthy of criticism, I made the most amazing friends. I had fantastic opportunities, including, ironically, the opportunity to go to Israel nearly free of charge. I had a fantastic dorm, so I am immensely grateful for the college that I went to. But gosh, Stephanie, she writes to me and she's like, "Hi, Julie. I'm writing to you as I'm leaving great books of the Western canon." That's one of her classes. Another class is Western theological tradition. And she has this line in the email that's so cool where she's talking about learning about all the religious and spiritual and philosophical and legal backgrounds or underpinnings of Western civilization. And she said, history now has a face and character, not just a sparse outline. How cool is that, right? Okay, so then there's Stephanie. I'll give you just one other teaser and then I'll move on, I promise. But I could go on and on about how amazing these listener emails are. There's a biology student, also in her mid-20s. Her name is Eliza, and she just wrote to me and she said that she studies hummingbirds. Right? Cool. So I wrote back to her and I said, I don't know very much about hummingbirds. Would you be willing to regale me with some fascinating information about hummingbirds? And so she wrote me the coolest email, concise but very detailed and super eloquent. And these birds are so interesting. I've done a segment on the show about owls, but hummingbirds, my gosh. First of all, these gorgeous hummingbirds have all of these different colors. And she talked to me about the shapes of their wings and how light refracts off of the wings to induce these gorgeous colors. But male hummingbirds are the ones with all the vibrant colors because they want to attract women. It's sort of like the peacocks have the males are the ones with the big tails because they want to attract the females. And then female hummingbirds are the ones with the more drab or camouflagey colors because they're in the nest and they want to protect their eggs. And she was telling me that hummingbirds flap their wings at 100 beats per 1 second. Can you believe that? 100 beats a second? And then they're so exhausted that they have to go eat every 30 minutes. Anyway, you'll get a fuller idea of what these emails include. But it's just to say I feel so blessed to be the beneficiary of so many people's wisdom who listen to the show. You can always email me with questions, comments, criticisms, whatever you want at julie@julie-hartman.com. So let's get to Will. So Will, as I said, is a 26-year-old Berliner, i.e. he lives in Berlin. We met up when I was in Germany and he's so cool. And he was writing to me about the way that German factions, political factions, are dealing with the Israel-Gaza war, because there's kind of a more obvious issue in that vein in Germany, and it's that there is quite a history of persecution, indeed genocide of Jews in Germany. So people in Germany, with regard to the way that they talk about Jews, with the way that they talk about Israel, tread cautiously, to put it lightly, on that subject. So let's just read a little bit of what he said about the left, specifically in Germany. So he says, "What distinguishes Germany from other Western countries, in my perspective, is that our left largely remains silent when the topic is Israel because they enter real cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, they get the information from the rest of the global left that Israel is to be regarded as a genocidal, imperialistic, colonial apartheid regime. On the other hand, there's our notorious history with the Jews being victim of the largest genocide in human history, perpetrated by our ancestors, and our responsibility to act accordingly as a result." I think that's quite insightful. And, we tend to think of the global left as being a monolith, especially as we're looking at our own country and the insane explosion of pro-Hamas outbursts, anti-Israel outbursts. There's a Harvard-Harris poll that was recently conducted, and it said something like, I have it on my Twitter, by the way, if you want to check out the actual stat, but it said something like nearly 50% of people in my age range, Americans 18 to 24, think that the solution to the conflict is for Israel not to exist. I mean, it's really scary stuff. But how informative it is that in Germany, understandably, there's this real cognitive dissonance that the German left enters into. So then he continues with the new kind, if you will, of anti-Semitism or anti-Israel sentiment that is in Germany. And by the way, I just want to say, those are two different things. If you criticize Israel, you're not anti-Semitic. If you deny that Israel has a right to exist, if you deny that the Jewish state has a right to exist, then that is anti-Semitic. So I just wanted to say that up front, that I don't think that criticisms of Israel alone are anti-Semitic, because these terms get tossed around all the time. But let's continue with Will's email. He says, then, the Islamic protests against Israel and the outrageous amount of anti-Semitism imported through mass migration from the Middle East and North Africa are played down, this is in Germany, because Arabs are allegedly a suppressed minority in Israel as well as Germany. Then, they remind us of our own homegrown anti-Semitism, blowing up its pathetic remnants beyond any proportion. And then he says the remaining Nazis in Germany are the size of a high school reunion. Or just throwing this accusation of anti-Semitism or racism against the Arab protesters indiscriminately at anyone who differs with them on their assessment of where the new anti-Semitism is really coming from. And finally, they use this media-induced fear of the right to reinforce their, and he has the German word, but it translates to fear against the right, which merits a whole email in and of itself. Well, Will, please send that email to me. This is just a snippet of a much longer email that Will sent, but it is quite interesting too, not only to contemplate the kind of cognitive dissonance that, according to Will, and I'm not proclaiming to be an expert on Germany, I'm just, going off of what he said and some his observations, as well as things that I read online. But not only is there this kind of cognitive dissonance, it seems, among the German left, but among the German right, there also appears to be this real sense of being very careful with what they say and do with regard to Israel. And later in the email, Will observed that actually a lot of those on the German right are quite pacifist because of the history in Germany, obviously, of being the epicenter of World War II. This could be an entire episode unto itself, but it's interesting to contemplate, when people talk about Nazism, they refer to it as a right-wing ideology. And that's partially true, but that's also partially not true. Dennis actually has a really interesting video on this on one of his fireside chats and also on PragerU, where he says that Nazism actually standed for National Socialism. So there was sort of the right-wing component of nationalism, or extreme nationalism, but there was also indeed that left-wing component of socialism, even though, of course, the Nazis were anti-communist. But communism and socialism are two very different things. So it is quite interesting that Nazism has been fully associated with right-wingism when the history... What these emails from listeners open up and inspire some really fascinating conversations. So again, please do email me at julie@julie-hartman.com. Do we have Spencer on or no? It's okay if we don't.
Yes.
Oh, we do?
No, we do. We have
good.
Spencer. He looks like he's gotten some sun.
Oh, okay. I'm very interested to see what Spencer looks like. But first, allow me to introduce Spencer, give you his full bio, which, by the way, is ever growing. He has a new book coming out. He has a new Substack. And sooner or later, I'm just going to be spending 10 minutes reading aloud all of this. But check out everything that Spencer does. It's utterly fantastic. Spencer Klavan is the features editor of The American Mind, which, by the way, yours truly has been published in, shameless little brag, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and the host of the Young Heretics podcast. Spencer's also the author of one of my favorite books, How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. And he just started a fabulous new Substack with his father, Andrew Klavan, no relation, called The New Jerusalem. And his forthcoming book, you can pre-order on Amazon. I pre-ordered it on Amazon last week. It's called Light of the Mind, Light of the World, How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths About God. And above all else, I think the most impressive thing on Spencer's resume is that he is the highest featured guest on this show, Timeless with Julie Hartman. Spencer, welcome back.
Oh, Julie, it's so nice to be back. You're very kind to keep track of all that. I can't keep track of it half so well as you did, so I'm going to have to just ask you to introduce me everywhere I go. But am I now, as of only this appearance, the most frequently featured, or have I been the most frequently featured?
You've been the most frequently featured for quite some time. I think number 2 is Brandon Weichert, who is a foreign policy expert. Okay. But you've got the top spot, my friend. Congratulations.
Wow, I'm putting that right top line item on my resume. That's going in my Twitter bio. I'm delighted.
I got to disagree with Sean, however. I don't think that you look like you've gotten some sun. You look normal to me, but let's go with it. Did you hear him say that?
I did not, no, but I think he is probably right. It may be the lighting, but I definitely spent a lot of time lying out in the hot Cambodian heat. So
yes.
That's probably showing.
So when we started the show a few minutes ago, I gave a whole background on our Thinker of the Month series, encouraged people to go and look at past episodes or talk about Marx and Nietzsche and Charlotte Bronte and Rousseau and Jesus Christ, among others, some big names there. But today we're kind of doing what I would call a OOTM episode, Observation of the Month, because as Spencer just said, and Sean noticed with the sun tan, Spencer just got back from a seemingly fantastic trip to Cambodia to see Angkor Wat. Right. Now, what's interesting about this is Spencer said that he went in high school and that he loved it and wanted to go back. I actually went in high school and I loved it so much and have not yet gone back. We actually have a photo or two of me when I had brown hair and was a lot thinner than I am now before the college 20 pounds. Yeah, there's me in front of I think that was called the Sea of the Churning Milk relief. You probably know all of these reliefs like the back of your hand. But yep, there was me. Do you have the other picture? Yeah, there's me in front of some other great parts of Angkor Wat. We should have gotten some photos of you. I feel so stupid. I should have asked you to send me some.
Oh, well, first of all, these are terrific. You're selling yourself way too short. I don't see what is it called, the freshman 15?
Yeah, freshman 15. For me, it was like the freshman 20.
Okay. Listen, same here. I've been there. But yeah, I should have sent you, I've got pictures on my Instagram, I guess, of all the temples. That is, in fact, the churning of the Sea of Milk, which, as I understand it, created the world. I mean, one of the most fun parts of this, which I think should be really enjoyable, is usually you have me on to talk about somebody that I feel fairly confident in my familiarity with. But actually here we're both venturing kind of into uncharted waters, or should we say uncharted milk?
Yeah, seas of milk, yes.
Image. Yeah. But yes, that is the churning of the Sea of Milk, which is an important creation myth from one strain of Hinduism, and it's one of the many, many incredibly detailed reliefs that are carved around this enormous temple. There are 8 in total, at least that I saw.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember learning about this when I was in 9th grade, and I was so captivated by it that I made my parents take me on a graduation trip. And so I just want to give people a little background of why we're choosing to talk about this. Of course, Spencer just went, but really what it was is that I'm not kidding when I read Spencer's bio and I say I've read all of it and listened to all of it. I am a constant listener of the Young Heretics podcast, which has made me into a healthier, happier, deeper person. And your most recent episode is called The Eye Has Not Seen. And Spencer talks about how we as humankind have grappled with depictions of the divine. And I'll obviously let you take it away, but Spencer just goes into a specific depiction of the main Hindu god who is honored or memorialized, if you will, in Angkor Wat. And it was just a hugely fascinating talk about the material and the spiritual and the nature of these depictions. So that's why we're doing OOTM instead of TOTM. But Spencer, I'll let you take it away. Would you just give us a bit of a background on Angkor Wat, why you decided to go, and about the god Shiva, who we'll be discussing?
Absolutely. I know that you, Julie, last time we spoke, were mentioning your own faith journey and some of the thoughts you were having about basically, I mean, it's crude to call it the marketplace of religions, but the truth of the matter is that a person in 2024 looking out at the world, especially in the West, has an enormous and kind of dizzying, overwhelming array of options to pick from. And one thing that I found really helpful in my own journey to Christianity was to survey what's been thought and said on this topic. I mean, I think we always have to remember that we are not comfortless. We're not without resources. There is a wealth of history and tradition. And one thing that you can do by looking at different options is you can see which things are kind of universal, like which things keep coming up everywhere in all times and places, and then which things are maybe specific or distinctive claims that the individual religions do and don't make. And this was my mindset going into Cambodia, because like you, I was in college when I visited, and I was so struck and haunted by these enormous temples. Most of them are Hindu temples. Many of them also have Buddhist later additions that came as part of the transition in the region from one predominant faith to another. But these are not in any sense mutually exclusive belief systems. And so these are enormous kind of repositories of, to me, a totally foreign system of thought. And Angkor Wat in particular, those reliefs that we were just talking about, they are extracted, many of them, from a poem called the Mahabharata, which is one of the many sort of lodestone pieces of Sanskrit literature. And it's most famous for containing a smaller section called the Bhagavad Gita, which I did actually read in high school when I was thinking about my own relationship to God. And one thing that you will find once you get past, for a Westerner, sort of the weirdness of the many different myths and this enormous pantheon, larger even than the Greek pantheon, is that you'll actually start to notice some things that just seem to always come up again and again in human history when people start to grapple with these deepest questions about what is there beyond the universe, what is there out there. And throughout the history of Christianity, there have been a number of different ways of thinking about this. Some early Christian fathers, like Tertullian, would say all of this is just demonic paganism. This is all nonsense, and you shouldn't even, what hath Athens even to do with Jerusalem? But there is another way of thinking about this that you can find in St. Augustine, and even to some extent in Justin Martyr and some of these other early church thinkers, that says, well, okay, so if you're a Christian, you believe that Christianity is true entirely and utterly. But you also believe that God made the whole world and that he endowed us with rational faculties for coming to know him through his creation. So it would be crazy if there weren't some things that everybody everywhere comes up against. And sure enough, this time around, when I went to these Hindu temples, I thought, on the one hand, you have this enormous kind of very pagan looking pantheon of gods and all these stories like the churning of the Sea of Milk. But quietly, in the inner sanctuaries of these temples, you also come across something that is still a major feature of Hinduism, and that is the Shiva Linga. So you mentioned, Shiva is one of the supreme deities in many strands of Hinduism, and in fact, there are three kind of either competing or identical, depending on whom you ask, supreme deities that sometimes get combined into one. It's called the Trimurti, and Shiva is one of those gods. The other two are Vishnu and Brahma. And so the first thing that struck me is, wow, here you have something that also occurs elsewhere, even in, like, say, Plato, the Greek philosopher, that when you start to think about the core essence of reality, things keep coming in threes. You have the tripartite soul of Plato's Republic. You have, in language theory, you have the word and the speaker and the meaning. There's this kind of just again and again, you have this tripartite structure. And here in Hinduism too, you have this three-part supreme God. And there are three sort of aspects to him. There's Shiva is the destroyer, Vishnu is the preserver, and Brahma is the creator. And when it comes down to how to encounter this entity, people start to have exactly the same problem that Plato had, which is, if this is really the supreme creator being, then any representation of him is going to be incomplete and inadequate. And that very same problem is really, I think, why the Jewish people specifically, compared to all the other religions in the region, said, no, we are not going to make any images of this being. We are going to give him the name that cannot be spoken, the temple, the Holy of Holies with no statue inside. And it struck me as remarkable that even in Cambodia, you also have in these temples the same issue with this Shiva Linga, where they'll basically say there is no image. Even all of these stories that we tell, all these myths, all of these different cosmic beings, these are all only symbols or allegories of something that is actually much more transcendent. And so the Shiva Linga is kind of their way of trying to deal with that. I just found that really rich and fascinating, and I'm actually curious to know what your thoughts are about it, since this is something I know you're grappling with as well.
Oh, I have many thoughts about it, but first I want to show a photo of it. I don't know did you already pull up the photo of the Shiva Linga? Forgive me if you did. But if you didn't, I want the audience to see it. So this is what Spencer is talking about. And Spencer, please cut in and correct me. But this is also a nice quiz to see how well I retained the eye has not seen episode. But essentially, so this is a statue, if you will, and it sort of looks like a cone with a basin around it. And as Spencer just said, this is a representation, if you will, of the god Shiva, the creator, who is sort of the one of the 3-in-1 gods that Spencer was just talking about, Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. And so this Shiva Linga, as Spencer said on his show, and as I'm going to repeat, forgive me for being improper, sort of was perhaps intended, or at least is interpreted now, as a phallic symbol. And the basin is sort of representative of a female organ, if you will. And so it's supposed to represent creation, as is the god Shiva, who is known as the creator. Is that accurate and a good description?
Okay, I give you high marks. And
A-, so probably.
The only thing is that well, Shiva is the destroyer, I guess. I'm learning as much as you are here, but I really like the picture that you chose, and I'm really glad also that you brought up, even though it's like kind of uncomfortable to talk about, it's also an element of these discussions in anthropological religious studies generally, that many cults involve sexual imagery. And that is, of course, kind of natural, because in our human experience, sexual union is what creates something out of nothing. It makes a human being where there was previously none, and a human soul. And so even though Christianity does not include phallic symbols in this way, it does nevertheless use that union as an image of something much more cosmic and profound. St. Paul says, I speak of a mystery when I speak of marriage for this reason. And so there is this debate within Hinduism whether the physical imagery comes first. That is, whether these are just basically ancient fertility idols. And the poem itself, the Mahabharata, contains some indications that actually, that this is what this is about. But on the other hand, in Sanskrit, the word linga doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean genitals. It just means symbol or sign, in the way that smoke is a sign of a fire. And so there are other Hindus that will say, no, actually what this is something that's prior to the physical kind of brute fact of the body. And the question really is, which comes first, right? The spirit or the flesh? And, I know my answer, and that's an answer that I get from John's gospel, right? In the beginning was the word, the immaterial, the mind, the soul gives rise to the physical and to matter. And I think that's the only thing that makes sense philosophically, logically, whatever. But the fact that they're having this debate is, I think, really telling, because it shows you that this is one of the core things. I think it's one of the core things we're wrestling with now as we deal with the role of consciousness in science, right? And we say, where does this matter? How can we have thoughts when we are supposed to be just brains, just chemistry sets? And I think the ancient and eternal truth is that actually spirit comes first. Actually, everything material is a language or a symbol for something deeper and more spiritual.
Mm-hmm. We are going to follow up with all of these things, but first I really just want to make sure I'm getting the accurate groundwork here of what's represented. So you were saying Shiva, the god, it was the destroyer, and then you said Vishnu's the preserver, Brahma's the creator. So there are these kind of three gods. But then, as I recall, you said that Shiva is sort of the one who is chosen to represent sort of those three, or to represent creation. Because isn't that what the Shiva Linga is depicting, with the phallic symbol and then the female kind of symbol, creation?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I see what you mean. So it's hard for, I think, Westerners to wrap our heads around this. It's hard for me, at least, that, there are many different, for example, denominations of Christianity, but I think you could also give an account of Christianity that every Christian would say, like, yeah, that's Christianity, the Father, Son, Holy Ghost. There are even more different versions of Hinduism. And in some sense, it was the kind of Western interpretation that said, like, there was even such a thing as Hinduism. And so there are versions where Shiva's the number one. There's versions where Vishnu's the number one. There's versions where they're all together. But yeah, this particular object is an icon or a stand-in for Shiva as, like, the supreme god, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. So my understanding of what you said, and by the way, obviously this is very complicated, and forgive me if I'm not, representing it accurately, but what you're saying is that we sort of, in the Western theological tradition, Judaism, more so Judaism than Christianity, but also including Christianity, we believe that the spirit came first. And then from that, we derive a material representation of God. Now, of course, in Judaism, as you said, there aren't many depictions, or you said that the name of God cannot be spoken. And in in Islam, there's sort of a similar thing where there's no depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. If you go to a mosque, for instance, there's all of these hadiths or verses from the Quran written in Arabic, and that calligraphy is sort of viewed as a divine art. But there's nevertheless no depiction of Allah nor Muhammad. Now, Christianity is a bit different, because most churches I walk into, you see the crucifix right there, or at least you see the cross. But there's a difference between those two, obviously, because the crucifix is depicting God or Christ. The cross is not. But just as a general point, you're saying that we sort of, in the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, tend to see the spirit as coming first, and then we depict the spirit in matter. But then how does this Shiva Linga depart from that? Are you saying they're depicting sort of matter and imbuing that with spirit?
Okay, so, I mean, that was very beautifully articulated.
I don't think so, but that's very kind of you to say. I'm just trying to understand.
But this is where we get into this important thing about, like, what's kind of universal and what's distinctive.
Right.
And I got into this because before I left for Cambodia, I was already thinking about the tradition of icons in the Christian church, and the debate over whether you should do what's called venerating icons. These are pictures of Mary or of Jesus that some people pray to, or pray kind of using these icons. And so here's how I would put it. What I realized by traveling, like, to the other side of the globe is that there's an issue here that everybody is trying to deal with, which is that
Forgive me, Spencer. I have to pause you. For some reason, are you hearing this too, Sean? His audio cut out? So sorry,
Yep.
Spencer. Not quite sure what happened, but
We'll
welcome
get
to
it back
live.
as quick as we can here.
Yeah, not hearing you, but it's okay. Our producers will come back with Spencer.
I'll just let you know when he's back, Julie.
Okay, yeah, it's not
We're gonna have to
working.
stall.
Oh no!
You're on the spot, my dear.
I'm going to have to stall right now. What am I going to do? I have had nothing prepared. Just kidding. As I always say, you know me. I always have backup, but this is a good time to tell you about My Pillow. So, I use a lot of My Pillow products. I wear my slippers. I sleep on the My Pillow. I use the Giza Dream bed sheets. I use my towels. And you can get a lot of these products at a discount too with the promo code Hartman, or if you call 1-800-566-6745. Now, obviously, My Pillow's known for the pillow, but they didn't stop at the pillow. They also created the aforementioned Giza Dream bed sheets, which look great, they feel great, they're ultra soft and breathable, but extremely durable, and they're made with the world's best cotton called Giza. You can get them for $29.98. That's 50% off with the promo code Hartman. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio podcast square and use the promo code Hartman. There you will get not only this great offer, but also deep discounts on all MyPillow products, including the MyPillow 2.0 mattress topper, MyPillow kitchen towel sets, now even flannel sheets, and so much more. Just call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman, or go to mypillow.com and make sure you use the promo code Hartman. Do we have him back or no?
There we go.
We're very close. Why don't you just reset
We'll
for
put you
people
right
that
back.
have just joined? the
Absolutely.
stream
That's
so they know.
Yes. So what we're talking about right now is Spencer Klavan's trip to Cambodia, where he saw the beautiful Hindu temple called Angkor Wat, which was created in around the 10th century AD. And we're focusing specifically on this depiction of the main god that is being honored, if you will, or commemorated in this temple, Shiva. And this representation is called the Shiva Linga. And we're talking about sort of iconography. We're talking about the spiritual and the material, which of those kind of come first, how we ought to view representations of gods. And we're having this great discussion how it differs between Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and how wherever you are in the world, whatever religion you're a part of, we all kind of grapple with these questions of the divine and specifically representations of the divine. We're back with Spencer Klavan. Good. Well, this is what happens when you're live. Stuff goes
Hello.
wrong and you got to deal with it. So as you were saying,
There's nothing like live theater. I know. Thank you for bearing with me.
No, it's
and I'm
fine.
sorry for the delay. Things were just getting really good. So
I know.
I'm glad to be back because. Okay, so here's how I would put this issue is. One thing I have realized by traveling around the world is that there is something everybody has to grapple with, and that is there anything beyond the world of the flesh? We know we have bodies. We know that we can see color and hear sounds and all of these kind of basic, obvious, immediate experiences. But we also feel with certainty that there is more to us than that there is also a soul, there is also spirit. And the question that everybody has to come up with is, if you want to encounter the spirit, how can you do that when all you have are your senses? And so every kind of sensory experience you have can communicate to you about God, but it can't be God. It can't be the same thing as God. And so, as you rightly said, each of the Abrahamic faiths that we are familiar with, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, has some version of dealing with this. And for Islam, I would say the prohibition is most extreme. God is so far beyond us, and the spirit is so much above us that there's nothing we can do or say or know that would be an appropriate depiction of him. We can't paint. We can't even paint the prophet. It's too holy, and it's not something that we should try to encapsulate in flesh or in any visible symbol. In Judaism, of course, there is also this saying that we don't depict God. But you do have images of other things, and partially I think that's because in Judaism there's more of an idea that God is intelligible. God can speak through his creation, and in fact the Psalms say that the heavens declare the glory of God. So there's some way that by studying rationally the world, we can come to know God. And there are Muslim versions of this idea, but I really think that's the Jewish kind of core insight. And it was Judaism really in the context of the Near East that came up with that idea and basically observed that everyone else was saying, that the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Canaanites and all these other faiths, the point of idol worship was that the statue really was the god. If it was in the temple, then the god was present. And Judaism is basically resisting all of that by putting its foot down and saying, no, none of these depictions can truly be God. Christianity, at the sort of third Abrahamic faith, has yet another insight, or another way of putting this, that I think is very profound, and that is that even though God is beyond our senses and beyond our apprehension, he is able to create images of himself, and his primary image is man. Let us make man in our image. And this, of course, is also part of Judaism. And so for Christians, God ultimately gives us the closest thing to a perfect embodiment of himself that we could imagine, and that is his incarnation in his son Jesus. So that already, I think, helps us understand the differences between those faiths we're familiar with.
Right.
And then when we go over to this Hindu question, then we discover that there's like a whole other sort of way of dealing with this too, that still comes up against the same problems, right? Either you tell all these myths and stories and you depict, as you said, you imbue these physical particular narratives with spiritual significance, or you back out of it altogether and you say it's impossible to depict. We're just going to use this object as a kind of placeholder, this stand-in for something that is transcendent and beyond all things, which is kind of one version of what the Shiva Linga might be. And I just think it's fascinating that everybody's up against this, and it helps me at least. I will never be a native practitioner or scholar of Hindu, but thinking about it helps me to understand more fully the differences between religions that I am familiar with, and why it is that Christianity is distinctive, why it is that Judaism is distinctive in comparison to all these other, engagements with the same question.
Well, it's very interesting to me, this debate. Is it sacrilegious to depict God, to show the face of God? And as we're saying in Islam, you do not depict the prophet. Certainly we saw, in Denmark when there were cartoons of the prophet, we saw how that worked out. But also just even if you are intending to, glorify the prophet, to depict the prophet or separately Allah in a, way of reverence, that is in Islam viewed as sacrilegious, because as you say, you cannot replicate the glory of God. And to do so is sort of diminishing God or bringing God down a few pegs. And, in Christianity, I have recently become aware of this debate where I believe and lucky I have you right in front of me to correct me. I believe in Catholicism, they have the crucifix in the church, but in most Protestant denominations, it's seen as similarly sacrilegious as it is sort of viewed in Islam, to depict God on the cross. So they just have the cross. Is that right?
Okay, well, so this is a great question, and yes, you're right that this was a major sticking point in the Protestant Reformation, was our relationship to images of God. That what Catholics do that really gives many Protestants trouble is actually not depicting God, but what's called venerating icons. And this is something that Catholics share with the Eastern Orthodox Church. And there were a number of debates over whether this was right or wrong in the history of the Eastern Orthodox Church, but ultimately both Catholics and Eastern Orthodox do venerate icons. And what that means is the icon is not God. The picture of God is not the same thing as God. But because imagery is our only way, because we have to have some kind of sensory encounter in order to know things, we use the icon as a window into heaven. That's kind of how
Right.
Catholics and Eastern Orthodox like to talk about it. Of course, the flip side of that, if the good version, if veneration means that this physical object is going to carry you up into the spiritual life, there is also the danger of the opposite happening, that this
Yeah.
spiritual object is going to carry you down into associating the spirit with the flesh. And I think this is a major part of these two directions are kind of what Paul means when he talks about the spirit and the flesh. The working of the spirit is to draw flesh upward into the world of God and the world of the soul, and to use it as a language for that. But the working of the flesh is to draw the spirit down, and this is called idolatry. And this is what Jews accused the other religions of doing even before Christianity. And so for Protestants, because as John Calvin says, the human heart is a factory of idols, the veneration of icons becomes this terrible form of paganism. It looks to them like just basically sliding back into what every other religion is doing. So this is a huge debate. But interestingly, I don't think it's the case that Protestants even would say, don't depict God at all. There are many very beautiful Protestant churches, although there are also many what you would call aniconic Protestant churches that try to avoid images or icons of any kind. But there is a reason, why in the Renaissance you get this enormous flourishing of Western art that is expressly Christian. It's helpful, I think, to compare it to Islam. You mentioned that there's an extreme prohibition on images of many, many kinds in Islam. And this is because of what I believe is called shirk, which is attributing partners to God. So not only is God above everyone, not only is there only one God who is, doesn't share partnership, but he's not even like anything else. He's so much more than us that there's no relevant comparison. And Christians would disagree. They would say there is only one God, there are no other gods. But because God speaks creation into existence, actually everything good is, in some distant and remote sense, everything good is like God. And humans, the human person, the rightly virtuous man, is most like God. That's, the most like God thing in the created world. That's why the Psalms say he's made man a little lower only than the angels. And so for us, this idea, what a piece of work is man, has given rise to this enormous artistic tradition and some dispute about how we should relate to that tradition. But we do believe, because we believe in the incarnation, that there is a holy and good and righteous way to depict God, which then leads on to the question, well, so do we venerate those icons or not?
It really is a profound idea, and something that all of us in humankind come up against in our own respective religions, the right way to honor and depict God. And, I have sympathy for kind of both sides of the argument. The sort of mechanism of thought in Islam that you cannot take this spiritual glorified being and somehow replicate it here. It sort of almost keeps it in its reverence if you keep it there, and you don't try to, in your inevitably inferior way as a human being, try to replicate what is so shatteringly perfect. But then also, I know, as Spencer, you were asking me a few minutes ago what I think about all of this as someone who is struggling with God myself and endeavoring to find my religious home, make God a central component of my life. It is immensely inspirational and moving to me to walk into a Catholic church and look up and see a crucifix, not a cross, but a crucifix. And I don't view that as a shabby depiction of God. Obviously, whatever depictions we do of God, as I said a few moments ago, are inevitably going to be inferior because we are flawed human beings who could never replicate such beauty and perfection. But looking at that, to me, puts me in the mindset of being a Christian, orients me in what I ought to be thinking about, which is, salvation, the sacrifice of Christ. And so I love kind of religious depictions of him for that reason. When we're looking at this Shiva Linga, however, it's interesting to me that this is the depiction of Shiva. This is the representation of something which cannot be represented. But the Shiva Linga doesn't have a face. It's not a physical or incarnate depiction of the god Shiva. It's represented through these symbols of creation. Why did they choose to do it that way? Were they purposefully avoiding putting a face on Shiva?
Yeah, well, so this is really interesting. There are some Shiva lingas that have faces or bodies carved into them as well. There are even some that are like really frankly anatomical, like in a much more obviously sexual way. But then, as you say, there are many that have no imagery at all. And I think that this speaks to something really important. If you take what we would call the aniconic approach, where you just say God is beyond everything that we can see and touch, and he's so much greater, so much more than we are, that we can't depict him at all, then a human face has no more relevance to him than a chair, right? It would just be pick any blunt object and just put it in there and try to deprive it of all features. And that is not the Christian idea. The Christians do put a human face onto God because we believe that the human person, that a human being, is the most near thing to God's heart that we can experience in this world. Now, of course, there is a whole tradition of Hindu, myths and legends about these are, the many-armed God or the elephant-headed God or what have you. But the centrality of man is in the image of God. This is the great Jewish insight in Genesis. Let us make man in our image. And that therefore actually human beings are special. Human beings are actually more like God than chairs are or than blocks of stone are.
Right.
And you can get closer to God by thinking of him as king, father, protector, right? That these words that we use, of course, aren't sufficient. They don't exhaust God, but they are true. And they lead us in this way that you are describing closer to who God is. I think that unless that's true, we're all kind of hosed. And I know that's like a silly way to say it, but we are embodied souls. Our access to the world, even if we access things that are more than physical, we access them through our embodiment, through touching and seeing and thinking. And we even think with a physical object, with our brains. And so there must be some way of translating the world of the spirit into the world of flesh. And that language is the symbolical language of art. I think God is an artist. I think he's created this way in for us, which is why those images are actually effectual. They do touch you. You're right that there's some sense in which they will always fall short. But I'm actually reading right now this wonderful book that was very important to the medieval church called On the Divine Names. And it's by this guy who has himself an incredible name, Dionysius the Areopagite. And if you agree with most scholars that this is if you agree with most scholars that this was actually a forgery, then he's even better because he's pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. And pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite writes this book on the divine names where he says these are the different things you can say of God. He's good, he's beautiful, he's virtuous, all these things. And yet, what we must do with each one of these is affirm them of God to the max and then deny them of God. And both of those motions are necessary. We have to insist that God is most good and also say that goodness as a concept fails to fully express who God is. And so we also need to understand that There is also things that we would call the ugly that are part of God's creation. And so these mysteries, I think, are best encapsulated by saying, as you kind of did, yes and, or yes but. No, we can never perfectly encounter God in this life, but at the same time, he has consented to be incarnate in his creation, and especially in Jesus Christ. There's a wonderful painting, and speaking of art, maybe this is a good kind of note to end this reflection on. Raphael in the Vatican painted a number of rooms, and the great Renaissance painter in the 1500s, and one of them is about the real presence of the Eucharist, and this long-standing theological question about whether the bread and wine of communion are really the body and blood, or whether they're just symbols, and whether, and in what sense do they become the body and blood. And just like the Greek philosophers in another one of Raphael's paintings, the theologians are pointing upward. Some of them are pointing upward to God, to say, no, God is above these physical objects. These are just symbols of what is higher than physical stuff like bread and wine. And then other theologians are gesturing horizontally at the bread and wine to say, no, we only know God through the bread and the wine. We have to have these symbols to connect to God. And what's so brilliant about the way Raphael does this is he places God above all of the theologians. So the Trinity is presiding over every part of this debate, that somehow in the endless discussion of the way in which God both is and is not capable of being depicted, God himself is present in all of that. It's in the discussion that the full truth emerges. And I think that's about right. I think it's true that we can never fully depict God, but I also think that unless we can get to God through depictions, we probably can't get to him at all.
Absolutely. And one of the takeaways from this discussion and from your Young Heretics podcast on this is that we can't derive the spiritual from mere matter. The spirit comes first. And in order to imbue matter with spirit, we have to realize that that spirit comes first. And I love that idea because it always puts God first, if you will, not just the depiction. And it's fascinating for me to kind of look around in everyday life, and this is a whole other show unto itself. We don't have time for it today, but how we live in a secular society, but I see a lot of people who, wittingly or not, are trying so hard to grasp onto the spiritual and trying to imbue their lives with meaning. When you hear people talk about manifesting, what are they really saying? They're praying, right? When you hear people say, oh, I think the universe is telling me that I need to quit my job, the universe is just a different word for God. And the third big way I've observed this is through things like crystals. Crystals are so, especially among people, girls my age, I know a lot of my friends, they have crystals in their houses and they walk around with crystals. And that's the epitome of trying to take something of matter and imbue it with spirit. But I love your observation that the spirit comes first, and the only way to imbue matter with spirit is to realize that spirit comes first. You can't just make a spirit off of mere matter. I hope I said that eloquently. By the way, we have questions in the chat for you. I know we won't keep you for too long, Spencer, but if you're willing, we have some listener questions. I don't know if I'm able to read them. Sean, can you put them up?
Yeah, we're going to put them on the screen.
Okay.
And you can ask Spencer.
Let's see. Where are they? Oh,
it's highlighted for you
there. I see.
There.
Thank you. What are Spencer's thoughts on the conflict between Islamists and Hindus in India? And then he put some parentheses, i.e. the recent Hindu temple that was built. Oh, yes, commemorating the Hindu god Ram. Now, this is a little off from what we're discussing today, but Spencer, if you're willing to answer that question.
Yeah.
We've got someone who's curious.
I'll do my best. So
Sure.
There is, as you indicate, a very long-standing conflict going back, I think, to the Mughal Empire between Islamic rulers and Hindu practitioners in India. And it is about exactly this problem. And since we've been talking about the Shiva Linga, there is actually a case that perfectly illustrates everything we're talking about, which is that there is a group of Shiva worshippers in Hinduism that wear a linga around their neck. And this was one of the major flashpoints for developing this discussion about, is the linga a phallic symbol or not? Because the Muslim rulers, who were very keen to take away or attack every other kind of religion besides Islam, or to at least to diminish it in people's esteem, would point to these guys that were wearing this symbol and say, oh, they're just worshippers of some phallic cult. And this was part of how Hinduism started to say, no, this is not just a physical object. This is actually a stand-in for something that is far more cosmic, that goes beyond any representation. And so, yeah, Hinduism and Islam have like taken shape in some sense in like dispute with one another in India. And naturally, I mean, Islamists are not, extremists in Islam are not the only people who attack temples, but we did see, for example, a very severe instance of this with ISIS when they were taking down many of these kind of priceless historical artifacts from the Babylonian and Persian empires, the Lamassu and so forth. And so I think you've got something similar with the Charlie Hebdo incident that you indicated. And I mean, this issue has become so intense in so many times and places, but Islam is definitely one of the, Islamism and Islamic extremism is one of the like responses to this that has become like just that shows how seriously people take it, and obviously represents to me a barbarous and evil way of dealing with the question.
Spencer, this was so enlightening. It was kind of a history lesson as well as a theological discussion. It was really cool. I so appreciate your coming on as always, and I'll see you next month for either the TOTM or the OOTM.
It's terrific. Well, anytime, anywhere, any reason, I will happily join you, and I look forward to it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad that you had a great trip. I'm glad that you're back safe. And everyone, please pre-order Spencer's book. It's called Light of the Mind, Light of the World: How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths About God. In Spencer's great book, How to Save the West, he profiles the crisis of meaning, which we talked a little bit about in this discussion. People are trying, wittingly or not, to find meaning, to find spirituality. And I think that this second book of Spencer's is a great way to remedy that crisis of meaning. So see you soon, Spencer. Be well.
Likewise.
And thanks to all of you so much for joining me for yet another live show. I'll see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. And you can always email me with your questions. Maybe I'll even read them on the air, as you saw about an hour ago. You can email me at julie@julie-hartman.com, and you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. Take care. I'll see you soon.